Hello and welcome to the first video in the Maths for Scientists series on our CPD EduChat channel. My name is Mr. Douglas, and in this video we're going to be talking about rearranging the equation or changing the subject of the formula. And I've called it both of those things because it's probably best for you in your science departments to be using the same terminology as the maths department. And in my experience, the different maths departments call it either rearranging the equation or changing the subject of the equation. So I would go have a chat with them and work out what they call it so that you can decide how you're going to refer to it in your science lessons. So what we're going to do in this video is we are going to explore BIDMAS. We are then going to look at the maths behind rearranging the equation or changing the subject of the equation. We're then going to have a go at putting those skills we've developed in the previous two sections into practice with the three-part or three-quantity equation. And then we're going to look at some more complicated equations where there's four quantities or more. So first of all, if we're looking at BIDMAS, maths teachers around the country use BIDMAS or sometimes BODMAS, depending who you're talking to help decide the order of operations required when calculating equations. By that we mean when you're working out an equation, you need to do everything that's in the brackets first, then you do all the powers, which is what indices is talking about. Then you do division and multiplication, and it doesn't matter which one of those you do first. It's seen as common practice to work from left to right. A lot of people think you need to do division first because it comes at the same above the M or before the M in BIDMAS, but actually division and multiplication have the same level of priority. So you work from left to right across the equation and do whichever one comes first. Then you do addition and subtraction, and it's the same with addition and subtraction as it is for division and multiplication. Addition and subtraction have the same priority, so you do whatever comes first from left to right. Now we're talking about BIDMAS in this video because actually when we talk about changing the subject of more complex equations where there are more operations than just division and multiplication, we need to work our way backwards through BIDMAS to decide what we're going to change first. And if that sounds confusing at the moment, that's okay. We will put it into practice later, so hopefully you will see what I mean then. So if we talk about the maths bit now, when we're changing the subject of an equation, we need to remember that we can't just do anything to it. What we do to one side of the equal sign, we have to do to the other side of the equal sign. And that's because that equal sign is telling us that what's on the left of it is the same value as what's on the right of it. So if we were to do something to one side, not to the other, we would be making that an incorrect statement, and it wouldn't work mathematically. And it's easy to describe that with numbers. So if we start with 1 equals 1, if we were to times that by 60, but instead of timesing both sides of the equation by 60, we're only going to times the right-hand side of the equation by 60, we end up with 1 is equal to 60. And that's just mathematically incorrect. It's nonsense. It's a statement. It's just not true. We can't make it. So what we need to do is times both sides by 60, times the left and the right by 60. So we end up with 60 equals 60, which is still a correct statement. And if we're to develop that further and use a slightly more complex equation, we can say 3 times 3 is equal to 9. And we know they're equal to each other. So if we're to divide both sides by 3, they should still be equal to each other at the end. So we can end up with 3 times 3 over 3 is equal to 9 over 3, or 3 times 3 divided by 3 is equal to 9 divided by 3. So we know that anything divided by itself is going to be equal to 1. So we can simplify our equation slightly by doing 3 divided by 3 is equal to 1. We can also simplify our equation by saying 9 divided by 3 is equal to 3. And we end up with the expression 3 times 1 is equal to 3. And the final bit of knowledge we need, and hopefully know, is that anything times 1 is just equal to itself. So 3 times 1 is going to be equal to 3. So then we can simplify that further to say 3 is equal to 3. So what we can say is both of these expressions have stayed equal because we've been doing the same thing to each side and then simplifying. And it's basically those skills that we're going to use in our algebraic equations. So we're going to start with an algebraic equation. V is equal to I times R. And we're going to try and change the subject of this equation to make I the subject. Currently, V is the subject because it's on its own. We're going to try and change the subject to make I the subject. So if we want to make I be on its own, we need to move the R. And the only way to do that is by division. So we can see there's only multiplication currently in this expression, so we don't really need to worry about BIDMAS and what order we do operations in. So we're just going to start by dividing. So we end up with an expression, V divided by R is equal to I times r divided by r. So you can see we've divided both sides by r. Then we can simplify, so we know that r divided by r is going to be equal to 1, in the same way that 3 divided by 3 was equal to 1. So we end up with v divided by r is equal to I times 1. And earlier we said 3 times 1 is equal to 3, so that means I times 1 is going to be equal to I. So we can simplify that further still, and we end up with the expression v divided by r is equal to I. And you can see we've now successfully rearranged our equation, or changed the subject to I by leaving I on its own. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to give you 2 practice questions. Please do pause the video. So in the first one, you're going to try and make t the subject. In the second equation, you're going to try and make I the subject. Pause the video, have a think, have a practice, and then when you're ready to go through the answers, just resume playing. So hopefully you've had a go at those questions. If we look at the first one, it's d is equal to s times t. So we're going to start by writing out that expression. Then what we're going to do is we're going to think about how we make t the subject. So again, there's only multiplication, so we don't need to worry about BIDMAS. So we can just start by dividing. If we want to move t from one side to the other, we need to divide. We want to make t the subject, so we need to divide by s. So we end up with d divided by s is equal to s times t divided by s. We know s divided by s is equal to 1, so we can end up with d divided by s is equal to 1 times t. And again, if we simplify that further, 1 times t is equal to t. So we end up with d divided by s is equal to t. And to practice the same skills, we're now trying to make I the subject. We can say p is equal to I times v. We now want to move the v, so we're going to divide both sides by v. So we end up with p divided by v is equal to I times v divided by v. V divided by v is equal to 1. So we end up with p divided by v is equal to I times 1. I times 1 is equal to I. So we end up with p divided by v is equal to I. So what we've looked at so far is dealing with 3 quantity equations. We're now going to look at 4 quantity equations, and this 4 quantity equation we're looking at now is E is equal to m times c times delta t. We're going to rearrange to make delta t the subject. Now again, if you want to pause and have a go, please feel free. If you don't, we're going to go through it now. So we're going to start with E is equal to m times c times delta t. Now this time we've got 4 expressions, but they are still all multiplication, so we don't need to worry about BIDMAS. We just need to worry about moving 2 quantities over, or 2 symbols over, rather than just 1. So because they're both multiplication, we can move them both over by division, and actually we can just do that as one go. So what we can say is, okay, we're going to divide both sides by m times c. So that gives us E divided by m times c is equal to m times c times delta t divided by m times c. And if we're to simplify that, we know m divided by m is 1 and c divided by c is 1. So when we simplify that, we get E divided by m times c is equal to 1 times delta t. So we know that 1 times 1 is 1. We know that 1 times delta t is going to be delta t, so we can simplify that further. And now we've successfully rearranged our equation by saying that E divided by m times c is equal to delta t. And finally, the kind of hardest way that we have to deal with rearranging equations, at least at GCSE science, is when we start adding in different operations. So we're not just dealing with multiplication and division anymore. So we can see that we've got p is equal to I squared times r. We're going to try and rearrange it to make I the subject. And we've got v squared equals u squared plus 2 times a times s. And we need to make u the subject. So what we're going to do here is have to think about BIDMAS. And again, if you want to have a go at these questions before we go through it, please pause and then come back and you can listen to the talk through. So hopefully you've had a go. What we're going to look at is p is equal to I squared times r first. So we want to make I the subject. Right now I is squared, so we do not have I on its own. We have to get rid of that square. However, if we're thinking about our order of operations and we're working through BIDMAS backwards, that gives us our order of things. So we're going to first look for addition and subtraction, and there are no expressions in there that have addition or subtraction, so we can move on. So we're going to division and multiplication, and we can see a multiplication sign there. So I squared is times by r. We need to remove the r from the right hand side of the equation, so we have to do that before we can deal with the power. So we already know that to move r from the right hand side of the equation to the left hand side, if it's times by r, we need to divide by r. So we do the same things as we've done before. We divide both sides by r. P over r is equal to I squared times r over r, or divided by r. R divided by r is equal to 1, so we get P over r, or P divided by r, is equal to I squared times 1. I squared times 1 is just I squared. So we end up with P divided by r is equal to I squared. Then our next step is to think about how we get the I on its own. So I squared, we want to get rid of the squared from around the I. The only way to get rid of a square of something is to square root it. And if we square root the I squared, we also have to square root the P divided by r. So we end up with the square root of P divided by r is equal to the square root of I squared. The square root of I squared simplifies to just be I. So we end up with the square root of P divided by r is equal to I. And now you can see we've successfully rearranged equation I by working our way backwards through BIDMAS. And again, now if we look at v squared equals u squared plus 2 times a times s, we want to make u the subject. We've got a square there again, but we have to work our way backwards through BIDMAS, so we have to look for addition and subtraction first. And we can see now that we've got an addition in the expression. So we need to do something about that before we can even think about square rooting that u. So that, as a statement, looks very, very complicated. But if I was to change that and say v squared is equal to u squared plus 4, we would all know inherently what we have to do to move the 4 from the right-hand side of the equation to the left. And that is simply minus 4. So instead of thinking about that 2 times a times s as 3 different quantities, we need to think about it as one expression. So right now we're adding that 2 times a times s. To move that 2 times a times s from the right-hand side of the equation to the left-hand side, we just need to minus it. So we take 2 times a times s from both sides, and we end up with this expression, v squared minus 2 times a times s is equal to u squared plus 2 times a times s minus 2 times a times s. 2 times a times s minus 2 times a times s is equal to 0, so that simplifies to v squared minus 2 times a times s equals u squared. Now I apologize, I've missed a line out in my workings here, but as you can see, the next thing we need to think about doing is removing the squared from the u. So to do that, we need to square root the u squared. And if we square root the u squared on the right, we need to square root the expression on the left. So we end up with the square root of v squared minus 2 times a times s is equal to the square root of u squared. Now the square root of u squared simplifies, so we can turn that into the square root of v squared minus 2 times a times s is equal to u. Now, if you wanted, you could simplify the left-hand side of the equation further, but really in a science exam, there's no need to. As students will be using scientific calculators, they can just input all their numbers into that equation with the squares and the square roots in the right places, and they will get an answer. So I wouldn't encourage any further simplification from that altering of the expression, altering of the subject. Hopefully you found this video useful, and we will be releasing further videos in the future on changing the units, so thinking about prefixes and how we convert units, and further ones on answering the maths and the equation questions. Thank you for listening.